We've seen the arguments surrounding the issue of whether English should be declared the official language of the United States. In this class time, I would like to look at more of the technical details, starting out with proposed legislation that would make English official, and to see in detail exactly how that would work. And then later on to say something about the role of the bureaucracy, specifically with regard to official language legislation. The English Language Unity Act of 2013 was introduced by Senator James Inhofe of Nebraska this week, March 5th. That was this week as I'm recording this. It's Senate Bill 464. This bill has been reintroduced in the Senate by Senator Inhofe repeatedly. At the moment, there are no similar bills that have been introduced in the House of Representatives. This is unusual. I have followed this business of official English legislation at the federal level for, I don't know, probably about 10 years. And usually by the second week of February, there are one or two bills in the House and at least one bill in the Senate that would make English official. This year, the House has not yet introduced such a bill. It could still happen, of course. The Bill S-464 has the following salient provisions. First of all, it simply declares that the official language of the United States is English, and then it defines what the official functions of federal and state governments are. And it says that those official functions shall be conducted in English. And the definition comes later. An official function is a function that's required by law, one that binds the government, or one that is otherwise subject to scrutiny by either the press or the public. This last part of the definition seems to me to be extremely broad. Now, I'm not a lawyer, of course, but I wonder if this law were to pass and be challenged in court, whether this third provision might be found to be what they call unconstitutionally vague. For example, I assume it would mean that if the President of the United States were to hold a press conference in the White House, that would be an event subject to the scrutiny by the press, obviously, and that if he chose to address the reporters in Korean, that would be against this law. But what if the president decided to invite a bunch of reporters for a walk in the Rose Garden, and he discussed matters of government and matters of interest at the federal level to those reporters in Korean? But beforehand he told them, this is not an official press conference. I've just invited you here to stroll around and to talk about these issues. Now, would that be in violation of this law? Would this be an official act, because in spite of the fact that this hypothetical president had just said that it's not an official press conference, it is obviously nonetheless subject to scrutiny. That is, what he says is nonetheless subject to scrutiny by the press. And so could he be found in violation of the English Language Unity Act of 2013? Perhaps a more... Now, in my lifetime, no president, and the first president that I remember clearly is Harry Truman, so it's been quite a few of them. No president has had the slightest inclination to address anybody in any language other than English. So the point is probably moot. That is, the example I just gave does not seem very likely to happen in the very near future. But imagine that you have a member of Congress who is running for re-election from a district that includes a lot of Spanish speakers. And suppose he has he calls a meeting, and he calls it a town meeting of his constituents, and he addresses that town meeting, say, in Spanish. Has he violated the law? Because he is a member of Congress, an official part of the federal government. He is performing an act that's obviously subject to scrutiny by the press and the public, and he's not doing it in English. Now, suppose that another candidate, not the incumbent, who is running for office, say, in the same district, calls a meeting and addresses the citizens of the district in Spanish. Well, maybe she is not in violation of the law because she is not yet a part of the federal government and therefore not under the provisions of this law. So she could have the same kind of meeting, address it in Spanish, and not be prosecuted for it. Suppose that were taken to the courts. Would the courts find that the incumbent has been discriminated against in this case because the incumbent is not allowed to do what the non-incumbent candidate can do? In other words, the subject to scrutiny by the press and the public clause is discriminatory in an unconstitutional way. So I would expect that if this became law, it's possible that it would be someone somewhere along the line would file a suit that would argue that there's something wrong with this third. Now, there are some other salient provisions. One that I find somewhat encouraging is that any member of Congress or agent of the federal government can use another language for unofficial communication as long as official communication is conducted in English. But of course this comes back to the definition of what counts as an official communication or an official function, which I find in the third part of the definition to be problematical. Again, I'm reminding you I have no legal training, so I don't know if it really is problematical, but I suspect that it is. Furthermore, if any citizen is injured by a violation of this act, they can bring a civil suit. Now, how could you be injured? Well, maybe you're, say, at the state level, and an agent of a state agency issues a document in Spanish, say, and does not issue that document in English, and you are a monolingual English speaker, or at least you don't speak Spanish, you've been injured because other citizens in your state have information that you can't easily get. So this law would say, in a case like that, you could sue. You could sue the state agency for violating this act to your injury. So I think that might be an example of where a suit could come from. What other examples might be possible, I haven't been able to imagine, but there probably are others. Very interesting to me is this law would require the Office of Homeland Security, That is the overseer of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, to propose new rules for testing the English language ability of candidates for naturalization. Now, when you're being tested to become a naturalized citizen, you are required to demonstrate ability in English. And we're going to see in a minute how that happens currently. This bill would ask for a new test to be developed, and the test would be according to the principle that all citizens should be able to read and understand generally the English language text of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the laws of the United States. Well, this last part I find a bit problematical, and it makes me glad I was born here, because if I had to take a test that required me to understand the English Language Unity Act of 2013, I'm not sure that I do understand it in any great detail, because I'm having trouble deciding exactly what, for example, an official function is, or an official communication. But never mind, I only have to understand it generally. Still, I think this might be a bar that would be set higher than a lot of Native American-born citizens would be able to meet. Still, the Office of Homeland Security would have to issue guidelines for a test that met this principle, if this law. Now, what happened next with this law? The bill was referred to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs the same day. That is, it went down to committee. There hasn't been any action on the bill as far as I know since then, but if recent history is any guide, that committee will refer it to a subcommittee where it will stay, unless one of two things happens. First of all, there is heat to take it up. That is, the American people suddenly feel that there is a need to have English become official, and they demand of Congress that they do that. Or if no heat develops, it will stay in subcommittee until the 114th Congress is sworn in, when it will be reintroduced by Senator Inhofe if he is still a senator then, or by somebody else if he isn't. At least that has been the recent history of these things. They get introduced, they get buried in committee, nothing happens until the next Congress is elected, and then similar bills are reintroduced and the cycle continues. Now, how is English ability tested now? The United States Citizenship and Immigration Service has made a video available that illustrates how qualification for citizenship is tested. I'm going to show you part of that video, and the candidates for naturalization are not real candidates, but they're people playing that role. And the excerpt that I'm going to show you concentrates on the testing for English ability. If you want to see the entire video, I have placed the URL for the entire video on Blackboard under Course Documents, and you can click on the URL and go to the longer video if you want to.
A large part of the naturalization interview involves reviewing the Form N-400, Application for Naturalization, asking you questions about the information you provided on the application, and reviewing the documents you submitted to support your application. When the officer reviews Form N-400 with you, the officer is also testing your ability to speak and understand the English language, one of the requirements for naturalization. If you do not understand something, you should ask the officer to repeat the question or explain the question using other words. Here is one example of the beginning of a naturalization interview.
What is your name?
Marcos Torres.
And have you used any other names?
No.
Do you want to legally change your name?
No.
I need to see your lawful permanent resident card, all of your passports, and state-issued identification, please. Thank you.
You're welcome.
What is your date of birth?
November 8th, 1970.
And where were you born?
San Pedro Sula, Honduras.
Are you a citizen of Honduras?
Yes.
Are either of your parents United States citizens?
No.
Are you currently single, married, divorced, or widowed?
I am single.
And where are you currently living?
3555 North Shore Boulevard in Bloomington.
Where are you working?
I work at the county library.
When was your last trip outside the United States?
Let me see. About 4 months ago, I went back to Honduras to visit family for about 2 weeks.
Do you remember that the day you returned to the United States?
The officer will continue to ask you questions from the Form N-400 to verify the information you've provided to determine your eligibility for naturalization. The officer may also ask you to provide additional information to the answers provided in the application. As a reminder, if you have a copy of your Form N-400, you may find it helpful to review it before your interview. For example, some of the questions that the officer might ask you may cover trips outside the United States, particularly any trips after the application was submitted, past marriages, memberships in any organizations, problems with the law, criminal history and/or jail time, military service in the United States, and support of the U.S. Constitution and allegiance to the United States. Your answers to these and the other questions determine your eligibility for naturalization. In most cases, after reviewing the Form N-400, the officer will give you the remaining portions of the naturalization test: the U.S. History and Civics test, the English reading test, and the English writing test. In some USCIS offices, the naturalization test may be given before your interview by an Immigration Services officer. The officer may be the same one that performs your naturalization interview, or it may be a different officer. The U.S. History and Civics test has 10 questions. The history and civics questions will be asked orally and answered orally. You must get 6 out of the 10 questions correct to pass the history and civics test. Here is an example of an officer giving the U.S. History and Civics test to an applicant.
Okay, are you ready for your civics test?
Yes.
Who was the first president?
George Washington.
Correct. How many U.S. senators are there?
100.
Good. Where is the Statue of Liberty?
Can you repeat that?
Where is the Statue of Liberty?
In New York.
Correct. What is the capital of the United States?
Washington, D.C.
What is the name of the national anthem?
Star Spangled Banner.
Good. Name one problem that led to the Civil War.
I'm not sure.
That's okay.
Remember that this is just a sample interview. The questions in this video are not necessarily the ones that you will be asked during the test. At the end of the questions, the immigration officer will inform you if you've passed the history and civics test. Please note that the officer will stop asking you questions once you've answered 6 questions correctly.
When do we celebrate Independence Day?
July 4th.
That's correct. Good, that's 6. You pass that portion.
Now, we will show a simulated situation of the English reading and writing tests being given to the applicant. Keep in mind that the items we're about to show you are not on the actual test. Remember, this is a simulated interview, and each experience may be different. The reading and writing tests each have 3 sentences. You only need to get 1 reading and 1 writing sentence correct to pass.
Now's the reading test. Please read line number 1 out loud for me.
Who was 3rd President of United States?
Good. Now, I need you to write line number 1 for me. Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd President of the United States. Okay, let's try another one. On line number 2, please write, the Liberty Bell is in Philadelphia. The Liberty Bell is in Philadelphia. Good.
After the reading and writing tests, the immigration officer will tell the results of the naturalization tests and interview.
Congratulations. This form is for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm recommending your application for approval. If my recommendation is accepted, you will be sent a notice in the mail of when to come in for your oath ceremony.
I'm going to get to why I think official English will come if a new immigration bill passes in a minute. But first I'd like to say a couple of things about the video that you just saw. First of all, it seems to me that the speaking and comprehension test that's folded in with the review of that Form N400 is much more stringent than the reading and writing tests, and even more stringent than the civics and history test. The candidate has to conduct a conversation with the officer, and if the video is realistic, the officer is going to speak at a normal conversational rate of speed, and the candidate has to respond to whatever she says. Now, what makes it easier is that most of the questions will be the same ones that are on the form, and the candidate has already filled that out in advance, possibly with help from other people. So the questions will be expected, and the answers that the candidate gives could even have been practiced. Now, in the excerpt we saw, the one question that required a little bit more, shall we say, originality or creativity than the other one was the one about whether you've taken any trips outside the United States. And Mr. Torres was required to describe in a couple of sentences the trip that he had taken to Honduras and why he went there, when it was, how long he was there, and so forth. Notice that after that on the video, candidates who watch this video in advance are told the topics that may be asked that go beyond the questions that are on Form N400, so that you could prepare for that as well. As it happens, the person who played the testee in the video, Marcos Torres, seems to have very good English, but I could imagine that you could, depending on the officer, you could meet the requirements of understanding, speaking, and understanding English without being as good at English as Torres was. Now, when you get to the civics, and especially the reading and writing tests, it seems to be very much less demanding. I know that candidates are given the topics that in general that they're expected to know about for the civics and history test. As you see, the ones that were asked in this example were for the most part quite simple. The one about the Civil War was a little more complicated, and in the example the candidate was not able to answer it. In general, since these are orally given and have to be answered orally in English, this in a sense continues the speaking and comprehension part of English ability as well. Now, the reading and writing tests are really, I think, pretty easy. You only have to read out loud and write one sentence out of 3 correctly. You can fluff 2 of them and still pass. Now, what would happen if the English Language Unity Act were to pass and this new test were to be made? All the USCIS has to do is revise the reading test. So presumably, instead of having to read 1 out of 3 sentences, they would have to read some excerpt from the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps they would get 3 chances to get to read one excerpt correctly, and if they knew this was coming up, they could practice reading those documents in advance. Now, I suppose if the officer wanted to be mean, they could pull up a law that the candidate has not prepared and ask them to read a part of that. I don't know exactly how that would work out. But the Inhofe bill would also require, quote-unquote, a general understanding of what the person has read from the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or some federal law. Now, as you just saw, there's no direct testing of whether the candidate actually understands what they have just read. They could have done word calling and still met the criterion as it exists now. Presumably, under this new law, the reading test would have to be enhanced somehow so that a determination of how much the candidate understood would also be tested. But notice again, the law only calls for reading ability to be tested in more depth. The speaking, comprehensive, and writing tests, parts of the naturalization test, could presumably remain just as they are now, because the law does not explicitly require a revision of that. Okay, why do I think that official English will come with a new immigration bill? The reason is because that's how it happened before. In 2007, President George W. Bush proposed an immigration reform bill. Now, that bill was quite widely discussed, but almost no attention was paid to the fact that an amendment making English the official language of government was attached to the immigration bill. The amendment was proposed in the Senate by the very same senator, Senator Inhofe, who just proposed the English Language Unity Act of 2013. However, to use an expression introduced by former President George H.W. Bush, this was a kinder, gentler version of that bill. It had 3 provisions. First of all, English is declared the official language, and the government must preserve and enhance the use of English as the national language. No one has the right to receive services or information except in English. If an exception is made and services or information are provided in another language, it doesn't set a precedent. Thirdly, if the government issues a form in a language other than English, only the English version counts for legal purposes. Notice that the second two provisions assume that there might be cases where the government would function in a language other than English. If it happens that information is given in a non-English language, that doesn't mean you have a right for that to happen again. So if you're, say, a Vietnamese immigrant and your friend gets a document in Vietnamese, and then you go back to the same agency and you only get one in English, you can't say, hey, I have the right to get one in Vietnamese too because my friend did. This law says that the fact that your friend exceptionally got the non-English information doesn't set a precedent. Similarly, the government can issue any number of forms, it seems, according to this, in other than English languages, but only the English version is interpreted for legal purposes. Now, if you recall from the video that we saw on Tuesday, Mauro Mujica, the president of U.S. English, was disturbed that so many billions of dollars were being spent to translate and print government documents in languages other than English. Well, if this amendment passed, it would not necessarily save any of that money because the government would still be permitted to issue documents in languages other than English. So it seems to me that the amendment, other than the English Language Unity Act, is almost entirely symbolic and would not substantially change anything that the government does. And if it had passed, we would have an official language in this country. It would be English, but whether anything else would change is very much a matter of doubt. Okay, so here's what happened to the amendment. It was brought to the entire Senate in June of 2007. It would pass if it got half the votes, and as it turned out, it received almost a 2-to-1 majority. So the amendment was agreed to by 64 senators voting for it, 33 against and 2 not voting. So if the entire Immigration Act had passed, we would now be sitting here in a country that had an official language, namely English, for the first time in its 200-plus year history. But what actually happened was both Republicans to Bush's right and Democrats on his left opposed the bill on different grounds, and the immigration bill didn't pass. So therefore the amendment did not go into law. So the point I would like to make, it was not the official English issue that failed to pass. It was the fact that it had been attached to an immigration bill that didn't pass. So if we get an immigration bill that can pass, I predict on the basis of this experience that I'm reporting to you now that the official English declaration would become the law of the land. I find it interesting to see who voted for and against the amendment. Of the 64 A's, you will notice almost immediately that the overwhelming majority were Republican senators. There are many Democratic senators that voted for it. That is, many of the Democratic senators that voted for it were from conservative states in the South and in the West, but there are a couple of exceptions to that. For example, locally, both Democratic senators from the state of Maryland voted yay. Ben Cardin and Barbara Mikulski. Both of them would be, by political standards in this country, would be liberals, especially Mikulski. The same goes for Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who is on the left in most issues. He voted yay, as did Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Again, a senator who would be considered to the left of the political spectrum in this country. Nevertheless, she voted for it. So the question then becomes, why might these senators have voted for a bill or an amendment be attached along with all these Republicans and more conservative senators? Well, of course, I don't really know the answer to that, but one possible answer is that personally they all really think that English should be the official language of the United States, in spite of their views on other issues. And they realize that this issue is not a hot button issue, and that they would not be punished at the polls by any of their constituents who would say, hey, I'm not voting for you because you voted for English to become official. Another possibility is that regardless of what their personal opinions are, they might have thought they would get more political benefit voting for English to become official. That is, there were more citizens in their states who really want English to be official than there are citizens who would be opposed to English becoming official. So that you get more political punch out of voting yay, even though it might not be your personal preference, because the desire to have English become official is politically somewhat more potent than any resistance to that. Now, of the 33 who voted nay, you will notice that an overwhelming majority are Democrats. And if you look at Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, the independent, as you may well know, he caucuses with the Democratic Party and votes with the Democrats on almost all issues. The one senator who was a Republican that voted for this, I'll get to in a minute, was then Senator Pete Domenici. But first I would like to point out, just as an interest, that our current president and vice president, who were then both in the Senate, voted against the official English amendment. Now, why did Senator Domenici of New Mexico vote against it and break with all his Republican colleagues to vote with these Democrats and the one independent? I don't know for sure why Senator Domenici voted nay, but I would like to point out that of all the states, New Mexico is possibly the most friendly to multilingualism, probably because of its large population of citizens with Latino ancestry. New Mexico is one of the minority of states these days, it's a minority, who have not passed a law making English the official language at the state level. Furthermore, a few years ago, a congressman from New Mexico proposed a resolution in the House of Representatives that encouraged multilingualism in general. It wasn't a law. It didn't say that anyone had to learn another language or anything like that. Just that It just said that if it had passed, that Congress would be in favor of people learning non-English languages. I don't know if it ever got voted on or if it passed, but the New Mexico congressman no doubt thought that he would get political credit for proposing such a resolution back in his home state. However, in its neighboring state to the west, Arizona, we have possibly the most hostile state to multilingualism in the country. First of all, it has the strictest official English laws. There are many states who have different kinds of laws that make English official. Arizona is the strictest, or one of the strictest. It has passed a law banning state support for bilingual education, and as you probably know, it has recently passed a controversial and very strict immigration law. I don't know why the difference is there between Arizona and New Mexico, but I'm guessing that the Anglo population in Arizona, unlike New Mexico, is enough of a majority so that politicians prosper by catering for their interests and can fairly safely ignore whatever the interests of the Latino ancestry citizens might be on these issues. By the way, it turns out from data I've seen that a sizable proportion of Latino ancestry people nationwide support official English. So if that's true in Arizona, you would have not only the Anglo majority, which I suppose is almost universally in favor of enhancing English, but also a pretty decent sized minority of the Latino ancestry population, so that a politician could count on both of those groups to support the actions that Arizona has actually taken. Now, let me tell you a story that illustrates how there can be something of a backlash from making English too prominent. A few years ago, I went to a conference in Tempe, Arizona, linguistics conference, and my wife Gay went along with me. This was just about a year after Arizona had passed its law forbidding support for bilingual education. And my wife clearly and probably intelligently didn't want to sit through boring linguistics papers, so she went sightseeing while I was in the meeting. And to get to the place where she was going, I forget exactly what it was, she took a taxi and got in conversation with the taxi driver, and the taxi driver complained. This was an Anglo woman. She complained that her children were being held back in school because all the Spanish-speaking kids, some of whom didn't speak English that well, were in the same class with her child, and the teacher had to slow down to make sure that they understood what was being taught. And as a result, her child wasn't learning as much as they would otherwise. So I thought that was kind of interesting for a state that overwhelmingly voted to withdraw support for bilingual education and insist that instruction be given only in English, to then find that it didn't work out so well for their kids, because if the Spanish-speaking kids couldn't be taken aside and given education in Spanish while they were learning English, then the whole class would have to slow down so that the Spanish-speaking kids wouldn't be left hopelessly behind. Okay, this is the end of the first section of this class. This is about official English at the federal level and the legislation that's been proposed about that. The second part, which you should also listen to, is about the role of bureaucracy in enforcing official English legislation and the role of bureaucracy in general, and this will involve some discussion of how things work at the state level.